All right, we'll go ahead and kick this off then. We're going to talk about, to follow up the confined space awareness, talk about some flowing grain danger. Again, we're going to talk about awareness. We're not going to get real deep into the rescue end of things. It's basically the same. It's a confined space rescue, so all of the same rules apply. The difference is obviously the flowing grain. How big? A couple things that we'll talk about is how big the problem is. Purdue University, since the late 60s, has actually been tracking grain-related incidents, so they've got some pretty good numbers out there. We're able to talk about frequency, the type of material involved, the sites involved, and then what they've identified through documentation as the contributing factors. We'll talk about the 7 most common types of entrapment, and then the things that we need to be aware of as responding to those entrapments. And then the last thing we'll do is we'll kind of talk about the whole thing, overall summary, and see if anybody has any questions. A few definitions. Obviously, when we're talking about grain engulfment or grain entrapment, we're talking about a flowable agricultural material, in other words, grain. Engulfment, obviously, is when an individual is submerged or partially submerged in that flowable material. And then overall entrapment is just a broader term kind of deals with not necessarily the grain silos themselves, but some of the other equipment that goes along with it, from your transport vehicles to mechanical equipment to outside piles, that sort of stuff. We'll talk about those a little bit too. And then obviously it is a confined space, so all of the rules that Mark just talked about for confined space rescue apply here. Okay, how big is the problem? Like I said, since 1964, Purdue University has recorded as much information as they can get their hands on dealing with grain-related incidents. And since 1964, there have been over 700 reported cases of grain entrapment nationwide. Unfortunately, and they'll talk about it a little bit later in the program, the majority of those 700 cases were fatalities. They've identified through, like I say, through the years of documenting these, that very few non-fatality incidents even get reported. That it's just the fatalities that end up making the news, that making the reports, having enough information to actually document things. And then obviously they've identified that, you know, this isn't just a United States problem, this is international as well. So, all right, average, there's about 15 to 20 entrapments per year. Grain engulfment awareness program here. Like I said, average over the last 4 decades has been 15 to 20 documented entrapments per year. And again, those are the documented ones, which most likely that means that somebody died. What they found through their research, through their documentation, is in those last 4 decades, the frequency is increasing. There's actually have been more fatalities in the last 4 decades going through things than or in the last few years. There's been more frequency than there has been over the time that they've been documenting it. Some of that they're attributing to grain conditions, and we'll talk about that earlier. Other parts of it they're contributing to some regulations and stuff that have changed in the recent history. Again, what they're saying here is that 47% of the documented entrapments have resulted in death, and they figured that there are many non-fatal incidents that go unreported, and primarily those are going to be your farm-related incidents. Your grain elevator entrapments are going to be reported because they're, those facilities are governed by OSHA and KDHE and a lot of the different government agencies that are watching that stuff pretty close. But the farm entrapments, there's nobody watching what goes on a farmstead. So those generally don't get reported at all, again, unless there's a fatality. And then they get documented because they send us out there to retrieve the body. So, all right, let's see if I can make this go on here. What's happening? All right, here we go. The mediums, we said we'd talk about the mediums a little bit. What type of grain are we talking about? They said that over the 4 decades that they've been collecting this documentation, that about 45% of all of the grain engulfments and entrapments fall into the corn and larger grain categories. Again, I believe that is probably the way they talk about it, because of the moisture content in the larger grains. They kind of indicate that the harvest is being pushed every year, trying to get those grains in, and not necessarily paying as much attention to the moisture content as they do during the summertime when they're harvesting wheat. The wheat is generally quite a bit drier and doesn't end up with the bridging and adhering to each other that you get with the larger grains. There's a demographic little map that shows off of their database that they've collected the fatalities per state. As you notice, Kansas is in the top 50% there, and then of course you look into your bigger grain producing, your bigger corn producing states. Those numbers are almost double to 4 times higher than even what we have in Kansas. Okay, the contributing factors. Again, they talked about the documentation that they've got showing that the number 1 cause of a grain engulfment or grain entrapment is the out of condition grain. It was too wet when it's put in the bin. The moisture causes it to adhere to each other and creates a bridging or a compaction against the wall that, unfortunately, somebody has to go in and clean that stuff out. It won't auger out. It holds up there. And with the regulations that the Food and Drug Administration and everybody else places on grain facilities, that stuff has to be cleaned out of there before you can put any more grain in. So somebody has to go in and break that stuff loose. So out of condition grain turns out to be the number 1 cause of putting people in harm's way. Second highest rating, this is the higher grain capacity handling systems. A lot of that, if you pay attention to what's going on in the farm industry, 30, 40, 50 years ago, every small community had their own grain elevator, and most of those had rail spurs that function for the grain elevators. A lot of that has gone by the wayside. So your bigger facilities are handling a lot more grain coming in and going out on a daily basis. Therefore, the higher numbers, obviously is going to raise your likelihood of having an incident occur with out of condition grain. And on down the line, they talk about working alone. Again, I don't think you see a lot of that in the grain elevator the grain facility setting, but you're going to see a lot of that on the farmstead type of grain bins and silos and that sort of stuff. The farmer's the only guy who's got to go in there and work that grain and keep that grain from going out of condition or keeping it from caking or whatever they have to do. The relaxed compliance with workplace safety regulations, again, we just talked about a little bit earlier before we kick back off. Compliance or complacency kills. You tend to get away from safety regulations because it's never happened to you, and unfortunately that safety regulation is there because somebody was hurt or killed doing exactly what you're doing, stepping outside of those safety regulations. So don't let complacency grab you. And then the last one is obviously the lack of knowledge. People just aren't aware of how quick it can happen and how serious it can be when it does happen. Okay, type of documented entrapments, obviously the flowing grain, whether that's coming in from the top, filling a bin, or whether that's going out the bottom, through an auger or a chute. Flowing grain will get you. I've actually got a video that's linked up through YouTube. I can put the link out there. You'll have to watch it on the iPads or your station laptops. Can't watch it over the network deal here. But it shows a grain cart, a semi-sized grain cart, where they've got a Rescue Randy in it, and they open the bottom chute, and literally in about 10 seconds, he's completely gone, sucked all the way down to the bottom of the delivery chute. That suction in that grain will really, it's kind of like quicksand. It just pulls you down. So the next documented type of entrapment is the collapse of horizontally crusted grain. Again, the grain is too moist. The moisture in the grain creates an adhesion problem, and it creates a bridge across the surface. As they auger the grain out of the bin, it creates a void below the incrustation. Somebody's got to go in there and break that crust loose. And if you're not aware of the hazard, if you're not aware of the danger, you get out on top of it and fall through, and all of the stuff follows you down and covers you up. So it's not a good situation by any means. Next one is the vertically encrusted grain. That's just the grain that sticks to the side of the bin. And again, the way the people out at Cargill talk, that's not a sometimes thing. That's an almost every time thing. There's going to be a certain portion of grain that gets stuck to the sides of the bin simply because of the amount of force that we're talking about when you pile wheat, corn, soybeans, any of those grains 120 feet in the air. There's a ton of force pushing against the sides down low, and you're going to have some compaction. You're going to have some that ends up adhering to the sides of the bin. Again, they have to put people in there to break those loose. With today's regulations, they cannot put the next grain into that bin until the previous grain has been completely removed, cleaned up, fumigated, all of that good stuff. Third entrapment type is obviously the transport vehicles. They talk about the majority of transport vehicles, that being your grain carts, your semis, your rail cars, any of those transportation type deals. The majority of the injuries that occur in those tend to be the kids, farm settings. Kids up there playing, get into the wrong place and get sucked under, or get in the wrong place and get covered up by the grain being dumped in. Obviously a tragic situation on a farmstead when something like that happens. Next one is the use of grain vacuums. Again, you're talking about a facility type of situation most of the time. The grain vacuums, if they're not paying attention to what's going on, they're usually sucking the grain up with the vacuum right around their own feet. As they start working, surface lowers down and then end up in an avalanche situation where they've created their own slope, and the grain comes in and traps them. Then you've got the problem of actually somebody recognizing the situation and getting the vacuum shut off before they're completely covered. So again, it's a self-propagating problem there with the grain vacuums. The outdoor storage piles and surface or storage surface structure type of an incident is usually during the movement of that grain. It's set outside. You don't see it a lot around here because we've got some pretty good sized grain elevators, but you get out into western Kansas with smaller communities, you almost always see the exterior grain piled up out there. What they end up having with those is when they start moving it, when they start using the loaders and stuff to move it away, they create a embankment that releases without warning and covers somebody up. So again, you've got tons of grain coming flying down from above that traps the people working there trying to move it. The last one is a storage failure. We've had a couple, 3 of those over the last few years. Obviously, the one out there in Russell where the two young men died, and then there was an elevator explosion up in Atchison, and then another one down by Hutchison someplace just in the recent past here. All right, here's a couple illustrations of the different types of entrapment. Obviously, we talked about the unloading. Like I said, when you start moving the grain with an auger, it loosens the surface tension as the grain moves down, and it creates like a quicksand, and it'll just pull you right down in. And they've got a chart that kind of shows you the speed of augers. A 10-inch auger pulling grain out at about 4,000 bushels per hour, and it only takes seconds to pull you to your waist, and about 30 seconds you're completely covered, and in 1 minute it can actually have you all the way down into the auger. So it doesn't take very long, and like I said, if you don't have somebody, the same rules apply here as in the confined space. You should have an attendant there watching, and somebody's going to have to recognize that issue quickly to get that auger shut down, or you're going to be in some pretty hot water pretty quick. The bridge entrapment, like I said, when they start augering it, there's a adhered bridging at the top, creates a void underneath, and if you get on top of it and fall through, and it all comes right down on top of you. And then the same situation on vertically encrusted, somebody in there trying to break it loose and bring it down, and it comes down all at once and covers you up. Freestanding piles, we already talked about that, and then the cart or the transport vehicle, and then the unintended release, like say whether that's a facility failure, opening a door that you probably shouldn't have, whatever it may be. And then the same story, like I said, we talked about the grain vacuum and how you work around and create your own problem by not moving around enough and trying to keep a flat surface that you're working in. Okay, response to grain entrapment. There are 3 different types of entrapments that you want to be aware of. The partial entrapment, in other words, legs up to the waist, maybe up to the chest or torso, and then complete engulfment. That's where the entire body is covered, and then entanglement in the equipment. Like I said, somebody's gotten pulled into the auger or some type of movement equipment and are not only engulfed, but they're also entrapped. Okay, responding to a complete engulfment, again, just like with confined space, you got to stop. You can't just go busting in there hoping to make a difference, because you're just going to make things worse. You're going to add to the problem by getting yourself in trouble. We got to stop, and we got to think. Shut things down, lock out and tag out the equipment, turn on ventilation fans. Again, when you're talking about grain handling facilities, there are aeration fans that the grain elevators themselves have that blow air through the grain, trying to dry the grain. That's not what we're talking about. We don't want to turn aeration fans on underneath the grain. It actually is counterproductive. It releases the surface tension, and you can cause people to sink faster. What we're talking about here is ventilation fans that you can actually get fresh air in and get the dust and what other type of contaminants may be in there out, and create a better atmosphere for both the rescuer and the victim. You want to, like I said, Grazi mentioned earlier in the confined space deal, you want to assemble facility employees. They know a whole lot more about the facility that you do. Lock out, tag out, how the belts and the augers and all of that stuff works. You're going to want those guys around to help you with that information. Obviously, we need to assess the situation and resources. Do we have enough people? Do we need more people? Do we need more equipment? What do we need? And then you need to have a specific action plan before we start. Not necessarily does that have to be a written incident action plan, but you have to have a pre-established plan of what we're going to do and try to work through the problem. Okay, rescue techniques. Obviously, removing the grain from around the victim is going to be the best removal technique. The problem is, unless you use some type of a grain retaining wall or rescue tube, any sloping grain, the grain is going to come right back down into where you're trying to dig out. Most of the north central Kansas co-ops anyway, I don't know if that applies to all of the grain elevators, but I know the north central Kansas co-ops went together a year or two ago and bought the coffer dams or the grain extrication walls for each of the facilities. So they should have something on site. Again, if they don't, you can always come up with your own, using plywood, using whatever's at hand to make it work. Anyway, entrapment, again, we can't just go jumping in. Like I said, the grain, if it's a sloped issue, the grain is going to continue to work down and continue to cover your victim deeper and deeper. That is going to make it a very difficult area to work in. You're going to have to be suspended because any contact with the grain is going to cause more collapse or more flow, and end up covering your victim that you're trying to rescue. So you've got to work suspended until you get the coffer dams or the walling or whatever you want to call it in place to hold the grain back. And then, because of the space around the victim inside your coffer dam, they almost have to start digging their own selves out. So you'll have to give them some type of a pail or a shovel or something to start, working themselves free. Have to be aware you cannot pull the victim out. If they're buried up to their thighs, what they say is it takes an additional 160 pounds of force to pull them free. I don't know if you've ever had that kind of force applied to you or not, but you're going to hurt something. You're going to, break arms. You're going to dislocate elbows, whatever it may be. So you're not going to be able to pull them free. And obviously, the deeper into the grain they are, the higher those numbers go. And you've got to dig them out. It's the only option. Like I said, don't waste time without digging with some type of a retaining device. It's just going to fill right back up on you. It's like digging in a sandbox. It just flows right back down in and fills up the hole that you're creating. So, like I said, create some type of a retaining device, whether that's made out of plywood or whether that's a purchased rescue tube. You got to get something in there, and then at the same time, don't forget you want to secure your victim. Use some type of wristlets. If you've got access to their body, get a harness on them, but something that can secure them in place. If you start moving grain, you don't want them to sink farther. Some different items that you can use to build your retaining walls or your coffer dams. You can use backboards. You can use pieces of plywood, metal roofing, a half of a 55-gallon barrel, any number of things, but you got to put something around the victim that you can actually hold the grain back while you dig out and release the victim from the grain. Here's a couple pictures of a manufactured rescue tube. Goes in sections and slips together. And there's actually, if you get on rescuetube.com, there's actually a video that shows that guy's got a little pail that he's in there digging himself loose. Okay, potential rescue hazards. Don't rely on the grain bin the grain bin ladders. Elevator ladders, when they were constructed and put in, generally are 350 pounds or less, and that was when they're new. If any of you guys were involved, the last couple, maybe even the last 3 grain elevator incidents we've had were ladder related. Ladder failed, and subject ends up falling to the bottom and has lower extremity injuries or worse. Obviously, the flowing grain and secondary entrapment, we've got to make sure that all of the grain flow is shut down, and then that we're not adding to that by walking on the grain or causing more grain to flow down on top of the victim, or getting ourselves in a problem and becoming a secondary victim and getting ourselves trapped. Hazardous atmospheres, don't forget that we're talking about grain. Anywhere there's grain dust. Grain dust doesn't take a lot of grain dust to be explosive. And then there's also, chemicals, whether that's, pesticides, fumigants, whatever it may be. There's always a potential for chemicals around grain storage. So you're going to want to, have your 4-gas monitors, your PIDs, anything that we can get our hands on to make sure that those atmospheres are safe. Another thing you want to be aware of is the overexertion. Like I said, it's tough rescue. Your first 30 minutes is going to be done all suspended off the end of ropes. It's hot inside of a grain bin. Even in the wintertime, the grain gives off its own heat, and it's just tough work. So make sure that you're rotating your people regularly, keeping people fresh. And then the last thing is obviously the grain handling equipment. Everything needs to be locked out and tagged out. Don't forget, just because it's off doesn't mean that if you lean against it or push the wrong thing the wrong way that it can't move on its own. If you start moving grain, it may unload and have torsion on it. It may want to turn back on you. Just be real cautious around all of your grain handling equipment. Okay. Again, back to the flowing grain. Never enter a bin while grain is moving, whether that's filling the bin or being evacuated from the bottom. Anytime grain is moving, you stand at risk of adding to the problem by becoming a secondary victim. Same rules as confined space. Like I said, you have to have an attendant. You have to have an observer present. He's your lifeline outside if the worst does happen, if things go bad. Always look for the bridged or the caked grain, and then ask about the grain quality. Again, it's the same as trench rescue. You kind of got to know what you're dealing with. Moist grain, like I said, moist grain is going to create an adherence issue with caking, but moist grain also is going to create an atmospheric issue because it's going to cause mold. It's going to cause a lot of different things that can pull your oxygen content down. And then obviously, like I said, we have to have a plan before we start. So, think before you act. Slow down, make sure that we're making good decisions. Any questions, any discussion before we sign off here? Nope. All right, that's all I got then. Thank you, fellas.